All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely strip away those Hollywood myths about roaring Viking feasts. We're going to uncover the gritty, honestly fascinating reality of the Norse survival diet. When we picture Vikings, we usually think of raids, chaos, and these massive firelit banquet halls, right? But almost nobody pictures the meal that came before all of that. Think about it. A quiet hour before dawn, a lone warrior with freezing hands, choking down something that smelled intensely of salt and sour grain. Today, we're looking at what they actually ate.
Because the Norse world definitely wasn't a nightly banquet of fresh roasted meat and bottomless horns of sweet ale. The reality? It was an ingenious and sometimes pretty brutal system of logistics and calorie preservation. They lived in a genuinely unforgiving environment. We're talking incredibly short summers, brutal, long winters, and a world with a line between a warrior who could keep fighting and one who couldn't. Well, that was often just a question of what he'd managed to eat in the last 12 hours.
So let's move into our first section, shattering the Viking myth, and looking at the reality of the morning before battle. The typical Norse working breakfast was absolutely not designed for pleasure. Forget your morning avocado toast or sweet pastry, this was purely functional. We're talking about dense, grainy barley flatbread baked directly on hearthstones. Zero rise, no fluffy oven crust, no softness whatsoever. Just rough flour, pressed flat, usually carrying a faint gritty char of wood ash right on the bottom. And, to wash it down, it was served alongside a bracingly sharp drink.
That bracing drink was called misa, and honestly, it perfectly captures the whole Norse mindset. Misa was literally just the liquid left over after making cheese. They'd seal it up, let it ferment slightly, and boom, absolutely nothing was wasted, not a single drop. This sour, mildly fizzy drink was basically their version of an espresso shot. It was meant to shock the body awake and keep you functional through a long, freezing morning of hard labor.
That brings us to Section 2, the technology of preservation and how they actually survived those long, harsh winters.
Since they obviously didn't have refrigeration, the Norse relied on a highly effective, low-tech preservation toolkit. They'd smoke strips of lamb up in the rafters, dry cod out in the freezing wind until it was literally as rigid as a wooden plank, and ferment coastal fish until it was, well, incredibly pungent. But here's the thing. A ship loaded up with this dried stockfish could carry enough calories to sustain a massive crew over ocean crossings that would have been completely impossible if they only had fresh provisions.
And this highlights a brilliant feature, not a flaw, of their diet. Food that required effort to eat was food that lasted in the body for hours. Take that smoked lamb, for example. It hung in the smoke-filled upper reaches of a longhouse until it was so incredibly leathery you actually had to tear it apart with your teeth. It makes modern beef jerky look like a soft marshmallow. But the sheer effort it took to chew this dark, intense meat, that provided a slow, steady release of energy, which was absolutely vital during rough sea voyages when you just couldn't stop to build a fire and cook. Then there's the herring. When the herring ran in massive numbers in the North Sea, time was the ultimate enemy before it all started rotting. So layering that fish with salt brine and onions in massive barrels, that wasn't some fancy culinary luxury, it was the essential technology that made surviving winter viable for inland communities. Over time, those onions would soften, becoming really pungent and almost sweet. That sweetness cut right through the heavy, oily fish so people could actually stomach the huge quantities they needed to eat just to survive.
Moving on to Section 3, zero waste, high calorie. Basically, eating everything to survive. Blood sausage is a pretty visceral, intense example of this rapid, zero-waste process. And it had to happen fast, in hours, before the blood could clot. When they killed an animal in the autumn, they'd collect the blood immediately, mix it with whatever fat and grain they had, pack it tightly into the cleaned intestines, and then boil or smoke it into dense little cylinders. It was a race against the clock to ensure absolutely no calories from that animal were lost to the freezing elements. Now, when speed was the only concern, they stripped meals down to the absolute bare minimum. Think of this as the Norse version of the ultimate fast food. It was literally just a piece of flatbread covered entirely in pure rendered fat from sheep, pigs, or, even seals.
We really have to reframe our modern mindset here for a second. Today, we totally obsess over lean diets, cutting carbs, and lowering calories, right? But in the Norse reality, caloric sufficiency was never a guarantee. Eating pure animal fat wasn't some kind of deprivation diet. It was an incredibly intelligent way to pack in the concentrated calories they needed to literally survive freezing temperatures and grueling physical labor. Fat was fuel, pure and simple.
All right, Section 4,
fueling the war machine and the logistics of conquest. Let's look at how they fed an army.
A key component of this war machine was skyr. Now, while we often see it labeled as yogurt in the grocery store today, back then it was closer to a thick, sour, soft, fresh cheese made from curds. Rations like skyr were packed with shriveled, intensely flavored dried berries, like lingonberries or cloudberries. They functioned exactly like medieval energy bars. They were compact, highly portable, and perfect to stack deep in the hold of a longship where whipping up a hot stew just wasn't an option.
When they were actually on the march, warriors relied on highly concentrated, ultra-light travel rations. We're talking dried cod that they'd just chew slowly with butter, wild hazelnuts mixed with dried apples, and reindeer meat strips dried stiff in the Arctic air. These were absolute lifesavers because they weighed next to nothing and required absolutely no containers, no water, and no fire to prepare. You literally just reached into your bag, grabbed a handful, ate it, and kept moving.
But when a warband finally did pause to make camp, the logistics totally shifted from those individual rations to mass feeding. A single iron pot of pea and barley war stew could efficiently feed 100 hungry men all at once. 100 men from one pot.
But make no mistake, guys, war stew was not good. It was basically just dried peas, barley grain, and whatever scraps of fat they could find. Imagine a pot smelling of wood smoke, wet wool, and the damp earthiness of old peas. But that perfectly illustrates the point. Norse campaign food was all about relentless reliability, not culinary delight. War stew was always the answer when you had to feed an army fast and keep them on their feet.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, the ultimate survival ration. This is really the climax of human endurance.
Because every Viking sailor or warrior eventually faced this terrifying question when they reached the very bottom of their provision bag. The freezing cold is setting in. The raids are running long. The ocean around you is vast and empty. How do you keep going?
Well, what remained at the very bottom of that bag was the absolute last ration, oatcakes. And I mean baked so unbelievably hard and dry that they had almost zero flavor beyond bare, dusty grain. They were designed purely to last for weeks or even months without rotting. You didn't make these to enjoy them. They were made to simply be there when absolutely everything else was gone. Think about it. Eating this final rock-hard oatcake in the pitch dark before a battle, that wasn't a meal. It was a profound, grounding decision. It was a warrior choosing to consume fuel and keep fighting because he understood that the human body works a whole lot better with fuel than without it. And quite frankly, because the only alternative to eating that stale cake was death.
So the absolutely crucial point to take away from all of this is that the historical reality of the Vikings, their legendary voyages across completely unknown oceans, the massive raids, their huge expansion, it was built entirely on the back of these gritty, resourceful survival foods. The Viking Age wasn't built on grand roasted feasts. It was built on rigid dried fish, sour smoked meat, and the sheer human will to chew on the last rock-hard oatcake at the bottom of a letter back.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. Looking back at the harsh, unyielding reality of the Norse diet, the ash-charred flatbread, the pungent fermented fish, the slabs of pure animal fat, which of these foods could you have actually lived on? It's pretty wild to think about. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep